Just a warning, this episode of No Filter deals with issues surrounding mental health. If you need help, please reach out to Lifeline on 13 11 14.
For me, I was at a point where I had spent 10 years feeling like no one would take me seriously. And I felt like I was finally like, I think people are going to take me seriously now. And then the initial reaction was, are you going to be a problem? You better not be a problem.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations that count. There have been 4 times in Honor Easley's life when she's felt completely and utterly hopeless. So hopeless that she's been unsure whether or not she can keep on living. And these times have not been fleeting moments. Some have lasted up to 6 months. Honor has dealt with her mental health issues on and off through her teens, and it's remained a problem in her adult life to the point where, at 25, she found herself being admitted into a psychiatric hospital. Most people would probably shy away from talking about their experiences in a psych ward, but Honor didn't. She leaned into it and she did something different. She started recording and writing down how it felt to be in such a bleak place, literally and emotionally and mentally. She spoke about what it felt like when she was asked by a nurse whether or not she'd give it up easily. And it took her a little while to understand that she was actually being asked how likely it was that she'd sleep with her fellow patients if they asked her to. And that wasn't even the strangest thing about her time in hospital. At first, she put a video up on YouTube from inside the psych ward, and it went a little bit viral. And then at the end of 2017, when she found herself in a better place mentally, Honor decided to turn her experiences into a podcast called No Feeling is Final. It's such a brilliant podcast because Honor speaks so openly about what it's like being in an abusive relationship with yourself. And she also explains what it's like when you've been asking for help for 10 years and you still can't get the treatment that you need. By sharing such a personal story in such a candid way, Honor has really given a gift to everyone who is struggling with their mental health and also to everyone who isn't, because it means that they'll have a far better understanding of what it's like after listening to Honor. Here is my very candid conversation with Honor Easley. Honor, in episode 3, you say something that just struck me and I wrote it down. You said, hospital isn't the place you go to get well, it's the place you go to not die. Tell me about the first time you went to a psychiatric hospital.
Yeah, so I went to a psychiatric hospital in 2014.
How old were you?
I was 25, which I think is kind of a pivotal age of existential angst. For me, that was the age when my Facebook feed started getting filled with people doing very adult things like having babies and buying houses and getting admitted to the bar and becoming proper doctors responsible for other people's lives, that kind of thing.
And what were you doing at 25? Before the psych hospital?
Before the psych hospital, I'd been doing a lot of stuff. I originally did a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and then I did a Diploma of Sound Engineering. I'd been working with artists, working in the arts. I'd done some comedy stuff. But what actually happened before I went to psych hospital was that I had gotten this new diagnosis near the beginning of the year, but also a bunch of other stuff happened. I had a big breakup with my then fiance. And as part of trying to deal with the diagnosis, I really focused a lot of my life around getting better. So most of what I was doing was going to work and going to therapy. So I went to therapy like twice a week at a hospital, group therapy.
What's group therapy like? I've had a lot of therapy, but I've never had group therapy.
Yeah, it's a very different beast. A lot of the stuff that I did was psychoeducation. So that's kind of like skills training. And I did all kinds of stuff like narrative therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of it's skills-based. I think what I found useful was often if you're in therapy, it's a solo activity, but there's something really special about getting to meet other people and airing your stuff in front of other people who are kind of in not the same boat, but sort of similar boats. There's something that can be quite powerful about that. And I met some really awesome people through that process.
Anna, what were you being treated for?
See, that's an interesting thing because throughout the whole series, No Feeling is Final, one thing I don't mention is what diagnoses I've gotten.
I know. I was thinking because I've listened to the whole podcast and I was like, did I miss that part or am I just not very advanced and I'm trying to like put things in boxes and actually it's not just about labels and you've got to look at mental health in a different way. Tell me the thinking behind that because it was obviously a deliberate decision not to disclose your diagnosis.
Yeah. So one aspect of it was just to keep the story open. The show is framed around the experience of being in a really hopeless, despairing place, not sure how to keep living. And by not putting diagnostic things on it, then people could kind of come to it more open. And
so you mean if you'd have said, say, I have schizophrenia, then I'd go, oh, well, I don't have schizophrenia. This is not a show for me.
Yeah, or maybe you might go look that up and then, I wanted it to be, often we don't hear people's stories without that language.
True.
So I really wanted it to be, I felt that made it more open and a lot more people could connect with it. And also, one thing that's been really great that's come out of it is that I've had a lot of messages, in particular from parents, who have said that the show has really made them understand what their kid is going through in a way that they really couldn't understand before. And I think that's because it focused on experience instead of diagnosis. But the other reason, which is the personal reason, is because I've gone through, how long have I been using services? 15 years, which is a long time since I was a teenager. And I found that those labels could be really helpful. They're really powerful. They often open doors for you in ways that are really, really useful.
What kind of doors do they open? Because I would have thought they would have closed doors.
Yeah, but they open doors in terms of access to services. So, you get a diagnosis and then there's often there's a treatment plan that you can follow.
We've got a form for that.
Yeah. There's a lot of power through that. I mean, when you go, even to get technical, but when you go to your GP and you get a GP mental health care plan, there is a place where they need to put a diagnosis down. As with any system, there's a lot of boxes that need to be ticked so that you can open the door and say, yes, this person needs this thing. So there's a lot of power in that way. And it is really, really useful to be in a situation where getting a label means that what is happening is real and it's not your fault. So that's a really powerful thing about diagnosis that I think is really important. But over time, I found that what was weird was that the further I got into the system, the more I found that these labels that I'd gotten could be used against me. Does that make sense?
In what sense?
So, for instance, the clearest example was that when I first was admitted to psych hospital, in the very first interview, so the intake interview with the nurse, which was the first person I talked to, that was a very eye-opening experience. And that was, as you said at the top, when I kind of realized, oh, this isn't a place to get better. This is a place to kind of contain me.
To be kept safe.
Yeah, but it wasn't going to be necessarily a place for healing what was happening. For instance, when I first got there, they do an intake interview, what's your date of birth? Are you allergic to whatever? And there was 3 things that they said that really struck me. The first was they asked, would I give it up easily? And I was like, what does that mean?
Would you give it up easily?
Yes. As in, if someone hit on me, would I be likely to have sex with them? And I was like, that is a super weird question.
Is that the phrasing that they use?
That is the phrasing that they use.
Give it up easily?
Yeah.
Wow.
And
how did you answer that?
I was like, no, that's a super weird question.
Not top of mind.
And one of the next things they said was that my self-harm wasn't that bad, that usually people with my diagnosis come in here all cut up and down.
And did that make you feel good or bad? Did you go, oh, phew, I'm not that bad, or gosh, I can't even do that well?
Yeah, I think I was just confused.
Yeah.
But also the other thing was I had for a long time had an experience of my emotional pain being dismissed by people. So I think that was just another example of that. And so those kinds of things can be quite hurtful. But the thing that really got me was that right at the end, the nurse said, "Now let me give you some advice. Don't tell anyone in here your diagnosis." And I was like, "What? You mean like other patients and stuff?" She was like, "No, the staff. Don't tell the staff. They'll treat you worse because of your diagnosis." And I was like, what is this place that I'm in? And I think that that's a point that really, really we don't hear about that much.
What do you, like, in what sense, without pushing you on what that diagnosis is? But is there like a hierarchy of, I don't understand.
There's particular diagnoses that have a lot of connotations and stigma attached. And often we talk about that as if that's a thing that the public isn't literate enough to understand. Does that make sense? But that stuff plays out in the mental health system a lot. And some of the diagnoses I'd received were associated with being like just difficult, basically. So basically she was kind of saying, you're not actually that bad. You're not bad. So don't tell people this diagnosis because they'll think you're bad and they'll treat you like you are going to be annoying or frustrating or attention-seeking or whatever.
Okay, because every diagnosis comes with it a whole lot of suitcases of baggage, and every health professional you meet has their own interpretation of what that diagnosis means. I'd never thought about that before.
Yeah, it's something that really doesn't get talked about very much.
It's kind of like you go to your doctor and you don't think, will you judge me if I have a throat infection, or will you judge me if I have, HPV? Like, you just think, but I'm just like, all bits are equal, surely, and all diagnoses are equal.
Yeah, I mean, like, each to their own. And I don't want to cast aspersions on everyone in the mental health. I have met some amazing, life-saving clinicians who have really full hearts, and it's really, really hard to stay that way in a system that lacks resources and is built on structures that, make you put people in boxes and all that kind of stuff.
Anna, in the months leading up to you being admitted to the psychiatric hospital, tell me what they were like. What led up to that day?
So, lots of stuff. There's actually a bit in the podcast where I talk about different ways of telling the story. So there's a bit where I talk about there's these two stories, and one is the medical view of what happened. Like, I was suffering from this disorder and I developed chronic suicidal ideation and, maladaptive coping strategies or all that kind of stuff. And then there's like the person side of the story, which was like, I'd had these big changes.
Tell me the person side, yeah.
I had these big changes in my life. I'd been through a really big breakup. I was feeling really lost in terms of my career, where I fit in, friendship groups, and my whole life had been focused around getting better. And I felt like I was even failing at doing that very well, which is a pretty demoralizing place to be, as you can imagine. And I remember really distinctly, there was about 2 weeks before I went to hospital, there was a bit where I woke up at 3 a.m. and I was just totally convinced that I had ruined my life, that I was like, I can't fix this, was the feeling. And that just didn't go away. And I'd had that experience before. I feel like I've had experiences like that last kind of about 6 months. Like it's a long time.
So long. I thought you were going to say like 20 minutes. 6 months is a long time of thinking that you've completely messed up your life.
Considering that is potentially what's happened, yes. And I think that the edges of, the exact timings are difficult, and I wasn't always 24/7 feeling that way, but like...
And that had happened to you by this age, when you were 25. This had happened how many times to you?
I think that this must have been at least like the third time. And then there's been a time like since then, which is also in the podcast.
Because the chronology of it, and I think that's a really important part of it, is that it's not linear. And you speak so beautifully. You describe the feeling of defeat when it happens again, and also fear, even as you come out of it and feel better, the ever-present fear and almost understanding that it is probably going to happen again.
Yeah.
And you don't know why and you don't know where, because it's not necessarily caused by a particular situation. It's just chemical for you.
No, that's not actually how I think of it.
Really?
I think it's very situational.
So for you, it's triggered by things in your life.
Yeah. I think it's really a response to
the world.
Yeah, a response to what's happening in my life. I don't think it's random. I think it's usually when I'm feeling really disconnected from purpose and place. So from having a place in the world, from having a purpose to life. And particularly when I try and replace those things with the kind of, I don't want to say like status measures, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But when you're in a place of like comparison and you're like, I'm not measuring up properly.
It's the worst.
And I have an identical twin sister who's incredibly successful in her own right. And I just think that she was sent here to troll me.
By the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like you couldn't get more confronting than literally comparing yourself to someone who looks and is exactly like you.
Yeah, we share a face. But she also doesn't, she doesn't have these experiences.
So she doesn't suffer from mental illness. Is that the right terminology that you like to use, suffering from mental illness? I know some people like it, some people don't.
Yeah, I mean, that's not language that I use.
What do you use to describe it?
I talk about, big feelings, scary feelings. I talk about going through periods of, I like to use lots of different language. So toxic loser syndrome is a term I use, or like my 6-month sabbatical to Doomtown, or like hanging out way too much with Doomy Dave Doomtown, all that kind of stuff, because to me that's actually more descriptive and more...
Less medicalized too.
Yeah. It's also kind of more fun.
And it's important to have fun. It genuinely is. So I think I talk to people sometimes who are suffering from terrible illnesses, and often they're terminal, and they will find a nickname. They won't call it cancer. They won't call it a tumour. They'll call it Bertha or something, as a way to almost, I don't know, objectify it or make fun of it or make it feel less scary.
One of the big messages is that the story that you have about your pain, whatever pain it is one of the key tools that you have for dealing with, processing and making meaning out of that pain. So I think that stuff is not only just about making it fun, it is a legitimate way of dealing with and coping with whatever is happening.
What do you do every day when you're in a psychiatric hospital? What's life like?
I want to say that I was in a private psychiatric hospital, and I was really, really lucky to be there. I happened to have private health insurance because this is what I mean about the power of the diagnosis thing. I'd gotten this diagnosis, then I got referred to this program, then I got private health insurance, then I got access to these programs, and then it meant that when I was in the situation where I was like, shit is getting real, I could say, I don't know what to do next. Is hospital the next thing that we do here?
Whose decision was it?
It was my decision. Yeah. No, I was completely voluntary. And what you do in a private psychiatric hospital is different from what happens in a public psychiatric hospital. They can be really, really different environments.
How so?
Well, I haven't been admitted to a public psychiatric hospital, but I've worked in and around them, and they can have they have less resources, less activities. So for instance, in the psych hospital I was in, they had like 9 to 5 activities every day of the week, not on the weekend. But so, you could go to all kinds of different classes. You could go to the walking group. You could go to the class on acceptance and commitment therapy. You could go to the youth class, that kind of stuff. So there was like a lot of activities.
And what are your fellow patients like? Like when you were there, was there a typical demographic? Was it really mixed?
I'd say it was reasonably mixed, but most of the time there's more women. It depends. Like, obviously, different wards have a different kind of makeup of people. Like, in some, there's an eating disorder ward, and that's mostly women, but not always. But the one I was in, there was a lot of variety of ages, but it was mostly women. Yeah.
Is it the stuff of movies where it's like people screaming and...
So it really depends where you are. So I'd say that on the scale of things, I had a very good experience to a lot of people. So I think that some other environments, particularly in the public system, can be... Like, I already found it scary in the private system, that I think it can be really scary, particularly as potentially a young woman. There can be violence sometimes.
Is that what you were scared of?
No, actually, for me, I was at a point where I had spent 10 years feeling like no one would take me seriously. And I felt like I was finally like, I think people are going to take me seriously now. And then in this situation where a lot of the ways people were talking to me wasn't about trying to connect with me, and maybe that I was going through a really scary, painful experience. The initial reaction was, are you going to be a problem? You better not be a problem. Which was like, if you self-harm in here, we're going to kick you out and you'll go to public hospital. So public hospital was used as a threat.
But I didn't understand. Aren't some people there because they self-harm? So it's like, if you do what you've been brought here for, we're going to kick you out.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that's yeah. I don't know.
I know it seems like it's, but it goes back to exactly what you said, which is how we started. It's not a place to get well. It's a place to not die.
Yeah.
And so the objective is just for everyone to chill.
Yeah, but and this is where it kind of gets to later on in the series, is when that happened again and I was in a similar place, I didn't have an option because I didn't have private health insurance anymore. I didn't want to go to a public hospital. I tried to get into another option that was similar, but because the public and private systems don't integrate well, I couldn't get into it, even though it was 200 meters from my house. Like, it was around the corner from my house and I couldn't get into it. And I didn't want to go to hospital because I was in a place where one thing that I've realized is that when I'm in that space of toxic loser syndrome, when I'm having long chats with Doomy Dave from Doomtown, I'm really, really sensitive to things that make me feel ashamed. And so that environment, and there was a lot of great people in there and really great clinicians that I met who were very, very human and kind. But I also know that there was a lot of instances where that really exacerbated my feelings that I was a broken person, that I was bad or wrong. And I just was like, I don't think I can do that again. So I was very lucky in that I had a friend who had a country house that was also free, and I had a partner who was incredibly supportive and who works in the mental health field and has had his own experiences of that kind of stuff and was free enough to be able to come with me. So we went to the country instead. So we went and hung out in the country and had arguments and played cards and meditated and, ruminated on what it meant to be in a place where you felt really hopeless.
There were two scenes on the subject of your boyfriend, Graham, that really stayed with me after I listened to the series. The first was right at the start, where you've got your fingers in your ears and you're singing loudly to yourself, and you explain in the voiceover that you're doing that because he's in charge of your medication, because you can't be trusted with it, and you do that so that when he goes and gets it for you at night, you can't see or hear, because you've also got your eyes closed, where it is that he's hidden it.
Yeah.
Because you can't be trusted to know where it is because of your suicidal thoughts.
Yeah, I'd say rather than can't be trusted, I would just say afraid of knowing.
You can't trust yourself. That's what I mean.
I feel afraid.
Yeah, which is a big responsibility for him, but one that he rises to the occasion throughout. And then another one later where he's trying to go to work and you are lying on the nature strip outside your house.
Very sexy.
Yeah. And saying, I don't think I can be alone today. I'm scared to be alone today. What's it like to be that vulnerable with someone? I don't know. There's obviously an enormous amount of trust and love there.
Yeah. One thing that we wanted to show, particularly with that first scene around the singing, which was that every night I would make up a different song, which would be like, Graham, you're the best, you'll get my drugs for me, or whatever. And often this stuff is talked about in a really downer of a way.
Yeah.
But that there are these moments of real lightness and
black humor as well.
Yeah. And
Just
silliness that often don't get shown. So we really wanted to show that. And also that this is the kind of stuff that when you hear that story, you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't know it unless you have lived it. You just wouldn't know that that's what you do.
At a different time, you find when you're moving house and you find the shoebox at the back of the cupboard with the meds in them, and you look at them, and at this time you're well and they hold no power over you and you have no fear of them.
Yeah.
And you just look at them and they're pills in a bottle.
Yeah, and I think that's what's kind of a really interesting thing about the experience is that it's an all-encompassing thing that happens at a point in time. And then when you move past it, it's like, whoa, that happened. That was weird. Like, I think it's maybe
Remember that time when I had to sing so I didn't know where the drugs were?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not that person anymore. How strange. Yeah. Which is why I think sometimes when I'm not in that space, I find I forget how shit it was. Because I think that, that's a pretty normal thing as humans. We sort of dissociate from really hard parts in our lives as a way of being able to keep going.
Well, it's why you call the podcast, I assume, No Feeling is Final, which is such a fantastic name for it, because in that moment, and as someone who has suffered my fair share of mental health challenges around anxiety, in that moment, you can't imagine ever not feeling like that.
Yeah, intellectually.
Intellectually, this will pass. But in that moment, and you can't get away from yourself.
Oh, God.
That's what's so hard, isn't it, right? That you just like, I can't get away from this because it's inside me.
Yeah, sometimes I think about it like, there was one point in the last run around the sun that that I was reading someone talking about their experiences and describing them as having an abusive relationship with themselves. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Because if you're in an abusive relationship with someone else, you would want to leave, right?
Yes.
And but this is a situation where, you don't want, that's the reasoning behind wanting to leave. But you don't want to leave. And the title No Feeling is Final is actually taken from a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke. And it's a long poem, but the stanza that it's taken from is, it says, let it all in, beauty and terror. Let it all in, beauty and terror. Nothing is, I forget it. It's like, there's another nice line in there, and then it's, let it all happen to you, no feeling is final. There you go. I found it.
And do you have to say that to yourself sometimes? This will pass, this will pass, this will pass.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had that Post-it note up on the top of my computer for years. But I think that the thing that I find wearisome is when it's like going on for months and months. Waking up most days having like a panic attack or whatever for an hour, 2 hours every morning. It's really exhausting. But what's interesting is that, often some of the things that help are the things that kind of make sense for nurturing anything, like sleep. One of the best things I did was fix my sleep in that
How
place.
did you fix your sleep?
Drugs and being really strict about, that thing they call sleep hygiene.
Yes.
Yeah, so completely dark room, no phones in the room, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Because sleep has like a, really, really, really big effect. Yeah.
For me, it's sleep and exercise and routine.
Yeah.
I need to know what I'm doing. I need to do similar things every day. I need to almost be on that goat track to just feel safe.
Yep. having a dog is helpful.
Yes.
My boyfriend has a dog, so.
Yes, I loved, there's a beautiful part where you talked about all the things you tried to do, because I imagine everyone's got advice, right? Everyone wants you to be better, both for you and also just to make their lives easier, I imagine, in a way. But no, there's a genuine wish for everybody to feel better. So people in a well-meaning way will suggest all these different things. What are some of the things that you tried? What worked? What didn't work?
Oh my gosh, heaps of stuff. So many things. I mean, I've been doing this stuff for like 15 years, so hundreds of hours of therapy. But the stuff that I find helpful is particularly stuff around skills. And one thing that I learned I came across this quote a little while ago by Jessica Abel, who's this comic artist, but she also does a lot of stuff around creative work and how to actually get your creative work done. Anyway, she has this quote that is, anxiety is energy without a path.
Yes.
So for me, one of the things that's been really helpful is like I have to really give my anxiety a path.
Yes, I think about it like a working dog that needs a job. Otherwise, it'll destroy the furniture and piss all over the carpet, and that's actually your brain.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, so you need a project and a distraction.
Yeah. So for me, a lot of that has been I'm like a massive kind of productivity nerdy type person. So I really get into that kind of stuff, like planning days and goals and all that kind of stuff. I find really, really, really helpful because it kind of grounds me. A lot of that stuff, a lot of skills. I mean, I've done a lot of skills-based programs, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy.
CBT and tapping.
Yeah. Narrative therapy. I did a really long one called dialectical behavior therapy.
What's that?
So that's a year-long program, and it's all there's three parts to it. I mean, the fourth part is kind of mindfulness, but the other ones are distress tolerance, emotional regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. All very fancy words. So that was like, a day a week of classes on skills, and then another day where I'd come in and do an individual session. So that was like a very intensive course. And what I found interesting is heaps of super useful skills around how to deal with people, how to deal with your feelings in effective ways. All this stuff was super, super useful. And my boyfriend at the time, I'd come back and tell him about what I was doing. And he would be like, you're getting superpowers, which was a really great frame for me because what's hard is that like a lot of the skills are the same skills that I find in like personal development, self-help world. They're the same stuff. They're just in a different framework. Does that make sense?
And just things for your toolbox.
Yeah.
That you can draw on.
Exactly. So that, and the other piece of the puzzle I would say is people. So that I usually think of like skills and people. So for me, being connected with people who understand the experience, some of the experiences that I've gone through, and offer up different ways of interpreting and looking at them has been really, really healing. And that I found outside of the mental health system, actually. Actually kind of weirdly found it by working in the mental health system.
In what way?
So after I started doing more kind of advocacy and then working with different organizations, and then I started...
Because you put a video on the internet, didn't you, on YouTube?
Yeah.
What made you decide to do that when you were in hospital?
So I put it up just after I got out of hospital. And at the time it was just like I was in a really confused place. And it felt like a way of kind of explaining what was happening. And also it just felt like the thing that was like made sense, which is weird. But I think that I've always sort of made my way out of crises in some different ways. So I've always made art projects out of whatever shit I'm going through. And the podcast is really partly out of that. When I was pitching it, I was in the dark place. It was actually me and my partner, because he helped me with the pitch. we had an argument at one point about it because he was like, I can't write this pitch right now because it's too hard being inside of it and then trying to make it into content at the same time. And I was like, fair enough. That's pretty fair. And also it was really hard to decide to do it because originally I didn't want it to center around my story. The very original pitch was much more focused around the ideas that come up in the show and much more like me interviewing other people.
You're the window or the gateway, I suppose.
Yeah, well,
your personal story.
Yeah, well, people connect with stories much better, and I realized that I actually got advice from someone at ABC who was helping me with the pitch, and yeah, it became obvious that it would be much more successful if it was hung off a personal narrative. So that's how that came about. But that took a lot of personal thinking about, and I was very cautious about it. And it's something that I do talk about because I get a lot of people who kind of want to do similar stuff. And I think that it really does pay to be cautious. And the people that I know who've done similar work as they've gone on over the years, they usually get more cautious in my experience.
Where does medication fit in?
Yeah, that was a contentious part of the show, as you can imagine. So
why was it contentious?
Well, because in one of the episodes I talk kind of about my whole history of psych drugs and basically about how I tried heaps of stuff and none of it was effective for me. And that's not something that people usually hear. And there's a lot of fear around saying that kind of stuff because there's fear that people will stop taking their medication. But the other thing that I think that we lose when we don't tell those stories is that for some people it simply doesn't work. It doesn't work.
I'll balance it out and say my medication works like a dream. So there you go.
There we go.
It's just a spectrum.
Yeah,
and for some people it works and for some people it doesn't. And I agree with you. If no one's ever allowed to say it didn't work for me, that's as damaging as if it's just a different kind of stigma.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you're hitting on something that I think was a really big theme of the show, which is that the reason why the point at which I was like, weird, was when there was a point where I was in psych hospital and I was in there during Mental Health Week.
Was it Harold the elephant? Marvin the elephant.
There was a giant inflatable elephant in the foyer of the hospital.
So you timed it really well.
I just right on the head, right at the right moment. And so I don't usually watch TV, but it was Mental Health Week, so there was a lot of mental health programming happening. And what I found super weird was that you would think that that would be like the perfect time because you got a lot of downtime watching a bunch of TV.
Yeah.
But actually I found a lot of the programming super alienating.
Why?
Because it just did not match up to what I was experiencing. So I talk about in the show that there's kind of two camps, and the first one is kind of the just ask for help camp. And for me at that point, I had been asking for help for like 10 years. I was like, help me. And people were often like, it's so hard to reach out. And that is important. Like, yes, we need to encourage people to help seek, but also we want there to be, stuff
someone
at the other
end. Yeah.
And there is there's the GP mental health care plan, but after that there can be you can really find yourself very much at a loss. So being in there and seeing that and being like, wow, this really does not match up with my life or what's been happening here. And then seeing that often the messages was that one, or it was shows that were about people. So talking about people in third person and the ways in which their life was totally ruined. And I was like, if I'm not in camp, if I'm not in that first camp, am I in number 2? Like, what's going to happen to me? And so I think that sometimes what happens is that we don't want to make it seem scary. And so it can focus like overly on stuff being really positive. And that loses some of the authenticity. And so for me, that really compounded the hopelessness that I was feeling, because I was like, I can't, like that's not my story. The simple, the just ask for help and then getting the help and then it all being okay isn't my experience. And that's why I wanted to have a go at telling a story that was more complicated and had less of a clean conclusion. I had the feedback. Someone said you could have stopped the show because there's 6 episodes. Someone said could have stopped it at episode 5, which is where.
Where you're planning out, I don't want to kill myself anymore party.
Yeah. You could have been like, and I found it, woohoo!
Yeah, I was happy in that episode, and then you go, that party never happened. Like, damn it! There's another episode.
What is happening?
But I think that was actually the most important episode because everybody I know who suffers from mental health challenges or times in Doomstown, every part of the spectrum is that for most people it's not linear. It's not a happily ever after. It is more like diabetes. This is a chronic condition that I have to manage, maybe for my whole life.
Yeah, and it's like...
So I think it was a gift that the podcast didn't end then. But you talk about the village.
Yeah.
And, you know, your partner, Graham, is a sort of a supporting character a little bit through the show. And he certainly seems like a wonderful support to you. But I wanted to ask you, you talked about in the show feeling like an unimaginable burden to him.
Yeah.
And like he says something amazing about you, that you are emotionally deluxe. Is that what he calls you?
Yeah. That was actually, the narrative's all like mushed up, but that's actually from a previous boyfriend.
Right.
But yes.
Okay,
yeah.
I do love that description. So, you know, obviously there are people and you've had partners that are all in, you know, all there for you. But when you are in this, I guess, role of often having these periods where you need a huge amount of support and sometimes you need someone to actually make sure that you stick around, how during the good times does that balance shift back where they can be vulnerable and they can have a crisis and you can be the strong one? Or can you feel in relationships, can you sort of be typecast as the one who's struggling all the time?
So one thing that I think is really interesting that we didn't have space to talk about it in the show, but in the show it presents it that I'm the struggling one and Graham is the like really, how is he so good? I've gotten a lot of people that are like,
great guy.
How is he so amazing? And I'm like, yeah, he's pretty great. But the truth is that he has his own stuff. Like he has his own messy life experiences and he has not necessarily been in the same place, but he really gets it. So that is part of his strength and why he is such a good support, because he really understands. And the other thing is, I think that romantic relationships or just close relationships in general, when someone is going through a hard time like that, which could be something like that, it could be going through a divorce, it could be grief over
cancer,
it could be anything, is that often what happens is that power differences come in. So as in people get stuck in roles.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of trying to get at.
So like Graham could really get stuck in that role of being the carer and
Correct.
I'm the person who's being cared for. But one thing that was really helpful was that we're both nerds about that stuff. So we're really attentive to that.
Yeah, right.
But it's not easy. One thing though that Graham talks about is this thing of rather than being responsible for being responsible to someone. So he said that there was this one point where last time, he met up with a friend and he was kind of, talking about what was going on and all this stuff. And the friend kind of said back to him, it sounds like you feel like you are like responsible for keeping her alive.
That struck me.
Yeah, and he was like, wow, that is it. I really feel like that.
Because he was like, at one stage he's like, you're saying, please don't go to work today. And I could hear him making all the mental calculations before you'd actually said it, but you'd kind of hinted at it, making the mental calculations. Okay, what do I have to do today? What are the consequences going to be if I call in sick or I don't go to work or I cancel things, compared to how likely is this going to end tragically, and
Yeah,
how
yeah,
will I
yeah.
ever be able to forgive myself? I could hear all those calculations in his head.
One of the pieces of context is that Graham doesn't have a normal 9-to-5 job in the same way. So he didn't. It was much easier to say yes to me at that point, and it was also much easier for me to ask for that at that point. So that's like a little bit of context. But one thing that was really helpful was that we both saw a therapist during that time, and we've seen a couples counselor outside of being in that space as well. So we're very cool with that. And the thing that we got to was that it was really important to be able to we had a responsibility to be honest with each other. And often what happens is that for the person who's in the kind of carer role is that their responsibility to being honest gets sidelined in place of looking after someone. So for instance, there were points at which Graham was like, I was like, I need you. And he was like, I can't do that right now. That's a really hard thing to say to someone if you are afraid. That's really, really, really hard. And so that was that was really important to both of us, because we knew that if we couldn't stay honest with each other about where we were at, as in me being honest with him about where I was at, because there were points, if you're going through this stuff for months, it can get tiresome.
It can. And I wanted to ask you about sex, actually, because, and I only bring it up because you mentioned it on the podcast, otherwise I wouldn't. But when you had that time, well, maybe I would, that time that you went to the country instead of the hospital, and you mentioned, we cried and we went for walks and we had sex, and I was like, oh, yay, I'm so glad. I'm so glad they're still having sex. That's great. Because that's something both with medication and just with the role of being ill, and that can really be affected in relationships.
Yeah, and I won't go into too much detail because there was complexity to that. But I think for the podcast, I really wanted to just throw it in there, because there can be a real thinking that when people are in that place, they're asexual and they kind of lose a lot of elements of their humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was like, I'm still human. We're still having we still have a relationship, and it has all these aspects. That's also why I put in the thing that we're having arguments. Yeah. Because I think that
because you're not a saint.
Yeah, I'm not a saint.
You don't get a complete get out of jail free card on everything.
And he wasn't, treating me like a baby.
Yeah.
And I think that was actually really helpful to have someone who was going to meet me where I was, not treat me like a baby, but also be caring, but not look at me as something that needed care and attention and nourishment and time and generosity, but not as something that was pathetic. And that's actually, it sounds simple, but it's actually a lot more intricate than that, to be able to stay in that space with someone when you keep waking them up at 3 a.m. and being like, I think I may have ruined my life.
It's like, again, do we have to have this conversation again?
Oh, man. There was a point. So I started recording the show is based on audio diaries that I started recording 5 years ago. And at the time, I thought that I was going to record myself getting better. I thought, oh, yeah, this is going to be the narrative, the overarching narrative. I've got it all planned out. And what I ended up recording was just basically that the narrative was super different to what I thought it was going to be and how it was commonly talked about. And I feel like that's changing. I feel like there's a lot more conversation.
And it was so helpful that you did it that way, I think.
Yeah. But there was a point in the production process where I had to hand over all this tape to my producer. Oh, she's such an angel. But there was some bits I had to listen back through and edit slightly, because I was like, I can't send that to you. Because because
it was too raw.
It was
and
too
personal.
raw, or just not right. And
not appropriate.
And I didn't think that anyone else would listen to it.
Yeah, right.
I had no idea really what I was recording it for. So I thought that if anything was going to be done to it, it would be me listening to it, so it would be okay. But yeah, that was definitely, I think was funny. Each part of the production process was kind of like, I knew it would be a difficult show to make, but there was like a big emotional layer to each piece that I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to have to send all those intimate recordings.
And also just going back to that space
Yeah.
and hearing yourself must have been hard at times.
It was super weird, actually,
Yeah.
like very surreal, particularly because the show kind of shows my trajectory to really just big shifts in how I saw and spoke about myself. And it was just weird listening to me, 4 years ago, talking about myself in this very, very different way.
I just want to end by asking you to give advice to people who are in the village around someone who's struggling. What should we do and what shouldn't we do?
It's hard to say because everyone's going to deal with it differently. So for me, I know that I need to be around people who see me in a particular way.
And what way is
So
that?
who see me as someone going through a painful human existential struggle for life. And one of the key people that was really helpful was a friend of mine, Gareth, who I still haven't met in real life, but we spent hours and hours talking, and he is a mentor of Graham's. So he was so vital to have someone who was older than me, who'd been through similar experiences, and who was like not going to shit talk with me. So it was like kind of mocking me and trolling me, like wasn't babying me.
Yeah.
But was also not seeing me as someone who was broken, but seeing me as someone who was going through this experience. And he talks about this thing, and he's written a book called The Procrastinator's Guide to Killing Yourself. And it's for kind of like when you're in that space. And he talks about that space as being the kind of photo negative of your life. So that place and that darkness is like the opposite to the life that you want. And it's a place where you can see what you want, but it doesn't feel possible. And those kinds of things are really, really helpful.
Because there's intrinsically hope in that
Yeah.
view of it,
Yeah.
isn't there? Because it's a frustration that something feels like it's out of reach, but you can still see it. So it's kind of like you want to encourage people to see this as something that they will one day have experienced, but that does not define them and every part of them forever.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing I would say is like finding the most compassionate way that you can relate to the experience. And that can come in many forms, because for some people that is a diagnosis. For some people that isn't a diagnosis. For some people that's, going to the woods. Some people that's getting a massage, there's a lot of different ways of achieving the same thing. So that's really about whatever works for you and that person. I think one thing that I would say is that, and this is actually documented really well in a podcast called Invisibilia. There's an episode called The Problem with the Solution. I don't know if you've listened to it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic podcast.
And they talk about one of the key troubles is when you are around someone and you're really, really emotionally invested in them getting better, that can actually be counterproductive because it can put a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
So the question is like, how do you walk alongside someone and accept them where they are and support them for making the choices, the changes, the life that they actually want, and finding the way in which that photo that they want of their life, the one in full color that they think might be impossible, finding ways in which that could be possible. Yeah.
Honor, one of my favorite sayings is that there are always people out there with a wound in the exact shape of your words. And that really speaks to the service that we do others and the generosity of spirit it takes to share something very personal and to share our vulnerabilities and our struggles. And I think your words in your podcast and your work ongoing in this space with your Big Feelings group and through your website has been balm on a lot of wounds. So thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done and continued it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been really, really special.
Thanks for listening to No Filter. You can listen to Honor's podcast, No Feeling is Final, in your podcast app. And read more about Honor's experience in the psych ward at mamamia.com.au/no filter. And if you're wondering what to listen to next, you should check out our book club podcast. It's hosted by Jessie Stevens, who's one of my co-hosts on Mamma Mia Out Loud, and it starts on December 16th. The book list has just been released and you can read it along with us. I'm up to my armpits in those books and I can't wait to hear Jessie and her co-hosts talk about them. Next week, I get real with one of our former Prime Ministers. Could be anyone really, we've had quite a few lately. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman. See you on Mamma Mia.